Hello everyone, this is Sodor Pro, back for another review. So today, we'll be shifting gears a bit, and we'll be looking at something that isn't produced by one of the big mainstream companies, and we'll be looking at something a bit more independent, right here on YouTube. A little sci-fi series called Murder Drones. This series is honestly one of the more interesting indie animated series I've seen so far on this platform. Why is that? Well, let's find out. This is my review on Murder Drones. Bite me! So, Murder Drones was created by a man named Liam Vickers. The series was first announced on the 25th of June 2021 with the release of the teaser trailer. Then, on October 29th, 2021, the series pilot or first episode was officially released. Fast forward to February 18th, 2022, Glitch Productions announced that the full series was now in development at their studio. Then, on October 28th, 2022, the official trailer for the show's first and only season was released, along with the release date for episode 2, November 18th, 2022. The show would consist of 8 episodes and end on August 23rd, 2024, with the release of the series finale episode, Absolute End. And that's about it. Sorry, but there isn't that much public information about the show's development or pre-production I could find as of the time of making this video. If you or anyone else out there has more information, please sound off in the comments. I would really like to know more about the show's development and how it came to be. So, given the fact that there's only one season's worth of content, I've decided to combine both the story and season sections together to make things a bit more easier on my end. So, with that being said, the story of Murder Drones is an interesting one, as you have Uzi Dorman, a worker drone who's trying to understand and save her planet from the mysterious Absolute Solver. I'm going to be honest and say that this show's story is a bit complex and confusing at times, but not to the point where you have no idea what's going on, at least on a surface level. I'll talk more about this later, but there's a lot of moving parts, so to speak, and you have to pay very close attention, as you just might miss something important. This is really the type of show where you kind of have to rewatch it once or twice to fully grasp what's going on screen. Though, despite that, I still have to give props to the character development the team managed to achieve in such a short time frame. Like, take V for example. When you're first introduced to her, she comes off as just a psychopathic killer, but as the show goes on, you learn why she acts the way she does, and was a bit standoffish regarding Anne and Uzi's investigation of the Solver at first, with it mainly having to do with her backstory on Earth. This ultimately ends with her fighting alongside Anne and Uzi to defeat Sin and the Solver once and for all. Another thing I have to point out is the animation, as it's really good. I'll admit it's a bit choppy in the pilot, but as the show progresses, you can see a slow increase in quality. Like, look at the way the drone's hair looks, or how they move in the pilot versus the final episode, and just how clean and fluid it all looks. But it's not just the animation, the score is also really good. It really fits in with the post-apocalyptic sci-fi horror theme the show is going for. I really encourage all of you to go listen to the score, especially the song Eternal Dream, as it's a really good song, one that really helps encapsulates the character's journey by episode 6. Speaking of which, the characters in the show are pretty good for the most part. As stated before, I really liked Uzi's character. I liked how she starts off as this angsty, outcast type of a character who wants to do more than just spend her whole life cowering in a bunker to, as she puts it, an angsty, damaged OC, while also realizing that maybe life in the bunker isn't all that bad. I also like her relationship with N, as the two are quite similar when you think about it, with Uzi being an angsty, edgy teen who no one seems to understand or really wants to associate with the exception of Thad, and then you have N, who's just this happy, innocent guy who's just happy to be here and do his job, but he isn't treated well by his peers, and they just in general really don't want to be associated with him. The two play off each other really well and make for an interesting couple. I just wish we got to see more of them as a couple. I also thought Uzi's backstory in regards to her mom and the absolute solver was interesting, as it creates this interesting dynamic between her and Nori. While granted she didn't have a choice, Nori is the reason why Uzi had the solver in the first place and subsequently kicked off the events of the series, and given what she says to N in episode 7, it creates an interesting conflict between her and Uzi. I just wish they delved a little bit more into it than what we initially got. Moving on to Uzi's boyfriend, N, he's honestly one of my favorites. I like his happy-go-lucky character, and his backstory is really interesting, as once upon a time, he, along with V and J, were also worker drones, but when Sin and the Solver went on the rampage, he was then turned into a disassembly drone, and then, after Earth was destroyed, was sent to Copper 9 by the Solver to destroy the worker drones there, to ensure no one could stop it. As stated earlier, I really liked his relationship with Uzi. The two just have this nice and sweet back and forth between the two. They really do feel like they're made for each other. As far as his other relationships, like with Sin and V, I find them a bit interesting, as Sin seems to have the closest connection to him, given how she sometimes refers to him as Big Brother, which I find intriguing, and I wish they delved into it a bit more. As for V, I find her connection to N interesting, as both she and J did remember what happened on Earth, but it seems like V decided to keep N in the dark, as a means to protect him. I guess it's due to what became of Tessa, and out of fear of what Sin and the Solver could do to them. Speaking of V, I find her backstory interesting. As stated before, both she and J remembered what happened on Earth, but V decided to not tell N what happened, in an attempt to protect him, as in V's mind, if they just went along with the Solver's orders, it would hopefully leave them alone. I also like the little arc, if you can even call it that, she goes through. In the first few episodes, she could care less about the worker drones, and is more focused on killing them off with the hope that the Solver would leave her and Jay alone. However, as the series goes on, we see her, like N, cozying up to the worker drones. A good example of this is her relationship with Lizzie. Moving on to Jay, I honestly don't have too much to say about her, but I find it intriguing how she, like V, also remembered what happened on Earth. But the difference between the two is, while both of them knew what the Solver was, Jay actually knew that it wouldn't leave them alone once all the worker drones were gone. But despite that, she still decided to go along with Sin and the Solver's plans. I guess it's one of those what do I have to lose scenarios, given that Earth is gone, and the ship that she and the other two arrived in was damaged and was supposed to be a one-way rocket to Copper 9. Now, as far as Tessa is concerned, I honestly find her a very tragic character, as out of all the humans, she seems to be the only one who saw the drones as an equal, and while that's nice and all, it did kind of lead to her downfall, as she was the one who brought Sin, the drone who was incorrectly disposed of, which made her vulnerable to be infected by the Solver, back to the mansion. This in turn allowed Sin, or the Solver, to go on the rampage and kill both her and all the humans on Earth, as well as turning N, V, and J into disassembly drones. I also find it interesting how her peers treat her, as after N stands up to her folks, N is chained up to a tree outside in the pouring rain, and she, J, and Sin or chained up in what appears to be her room, which I guess kind of further explains why she's a bit more sympathetic to the drones, which again, I find both interesting and a bit sad to see, especially given that she still tries to save her folks, which she's ultimately unsuccessful in the end, and her body ends up being used as a skin suit for Sin. Moving on to Sin herself, I find her very fascinating, as back on Earth, she was treated very poorly due to her glitchy demeanor. This would contribute to her being sent to the dump to be disposed of. However, whoever was tasked to do so didn't do it properly, as it led to her being allowed to boot up and be vulnerable to be infected by the solver. And to be honest, given how her owners treated her, yeah, I can see why she let the solver infect her body, in a likely attempt to get revenge on the humans for treating her so poorly. And while that doesn't justify what she did, I mean, it basically led to Earth and all humans being eliminated, which, as a human, yeah, not cool, girl. It's still understandable as to why she let the solver take over her body, or programming, and why she went on that rampage on Earth. Apart from that, she's a fun villain. I like her eerie demeanor, like even in her official introduction in the 5th episode, Home, she may seem innocent, but you can tell something's not right about her. I also find her dynamic with N interesting, as she constantly refers to him as Big Brother, which seems to imply that despite allowing the solver to do what it did to her, and the rest of Earth and Copper 9, it's clear that she does have some respect for N. This is only reinforced by what she says to him in the 7th episode, Mass Destruction. I wish we saw more of their dynamic. Finally, we have Doll, who is an interesting one, as her story kind of mirrors Uzi's story, with the fact that her mother, Yiva, was also experimented by the humans in an attempt to better understand the absolute solver. And just like what happened with Nori, Yiva would also unfortunately pass down the solver to Doll. But unlike Nori, who briefly went insane and then disappeared sometime after the planet imploded and when the disassembly drones arrived, Yiva basically stayed and cared for Doll. That was until the disassembly drones found and killed both her and Doll's father, leaving Doll with effectively no one to care for her. Yeah, she did have Lizzie, but even then, she had no real parental figure in her life, while Uzi had her father, as flawed as he is. Her parents' passing would ultimately activate the solver inside of her, though the way it operates in her seems to be different compared to how it functions in Uzi, with the solver in Uzi giving her powers similar to a disassembly drone, and the solver in Doll giving her the ability to teleport. However, both still need oil to prevent themselves from overheating, and still project that solver symbol when picking up things. Another key difference is that while Uzi decided to figure out what was going on with the help of her friends, Doll decided to go in alone, which ultimately led to her demise. Her story is honestly a more darker version of Uzi's. That being if Uzi really leaned into the fact that she's an outcast and if she never befriended N. It's an interesting parallel between the characters. As far as the rest of the cast is concerned, they're alright, though due to the fact there's only 8 episodes, we hardly get to learn that much about them. Lizzie was an interesting character. I thought her dynamic with Doll and V were interesting. I'm going to start sounding like a broken record, but I wish we got to see more of their dynamics, as all we really know about Lizzie is that she's just a stereotypical cool popular girl who antagonizes the main protagonists. That was interesting, as it seems like he was the only real friend Uzi had before she met Anne. I wish we got to see more of him, as after episode 3, he kind of just disappears and then randomly comes back for episodes 7 and 8. Next we have Nori, who I thought was interesting, as it seems like she kind of predicted the arrival of the disassembly drones, and she feels a sense of guilt for passing down the solver to Uzi, which I find interesting. Like, she felt guilty to the point where she told Anne after he found her core that when they found Uzi to not reveal to her that she was Nori. Though, of course, Anne ultimately reveals to Uzi that drone core is Nori in an honestly amusing way. As far as our dynamics with Khan and Uzi, well, it seems like both her and Khan still have a thing for one another, and he clearly still loves her, in spite of everything that happened. But other than that, there isn't much to say about their relationship. The same can be said with Uzi. Like, Nori is a big motivator as to why Uzi initially wanted to murder all humans, and then subsequently wanting to know what the solver was and how to stop sin. But again, outside of that, we don't get to see much of their dynamic. The most we get is the brief reunion scene at the beginning of episode 8, and that's it. And finally, we have Khan. All I can say is that he isn't winning Father of the Year. I mean, the guy literally left his daughter to die in episode 1. I mean, I guess he kind of redeemed himself when he, Thad, and Lizzie attempted to help in episode 8, even though they didn't really do anything, and V was the one who ultimately fought off Jay. But I do like how he did contribute to Uzi, and subsequently Doll, learning about the camp, which led to them finding that robotic bug key thing that led them to that basement, where that church was located. I also find the fact that his obsession with doors seems to likely stem from trauma, after initially thinking that Nori was killed by the disassembly drones, and the fact that he had to put her out of her misery, which again, I find both interesting and a bit sad. Aside from that, there really isn't that much to him. I mean, his dynamic with Uzi isn't really delved that much into, though it's clear they've become distant in recent years, but the series doesn't really address this, with the exception of episode 3, or resolve it by the end of the show. So, overall, the characters, mainly the ones who get primary focus, are really solid. There are some really good moments with them. It's just the way the series is set up, mainly in terms of length, which I'll get to later, that's really holding them back. Again, what we got was good, but I feel like there could have been more done with them, had this series had maybe a few more episodes, which again, I'll get to later. There are many good things to say about the series. As stated previous, the characters, mainly the main cast, like N, Uzi, and V, are really good. I really like their dynamics, as they all play off each other really well, especially N and Uzi. My next positive point is the writing. It's really solid. While the pacing is a bit quick for my liking, I still like how the story never loses focus. There's never a point where it feels like it's dragging. I also need to give props to the close continuity, as they managed to do a decent job in tying almost everything together to form a decently cohesive narrative. I also like the subtle details and foreshadowing hidden throughout the show, like the references to the solver in the drone's visors, Tessa's body in the background, the zombie drone's VHS tape, etc. Like, yeah, you can get a basic general idea after an initial watch, though once you fully rewatch the show and pay close attention to the little details, that's when you can really appreciate the close continuity of the series, which I see as one of the series' strongest suits, and maybe one of its weaker ones, which I'll talk about more in a bit. But it's not just the characters or writing. The animation for an indie animated series is amazing. Admittedly, it is a little rough in the first episode, which I mean I can somewhat excuse because it's the pilot, and thankfully it improves as the series goes on. The movements become more fluid and less choppy, which is apparent in the series finale. I also like the clever visual details, like in the spire of drone corpses. Like, yeah, those are robot parts, but the way the set is lit and the snow is layered makes the robotic parts look like bones. And then you get to episode 3, like, you know that's oil. But again, the way the lighting is set up and the framing of the shots makes it look less like oil and more like blood. Another thing I have to give praise to is the score. It has this really cool, eerie sci-fi feel to it, and, like the animation, really does help sell the post-apocalyptic atmosphere. My favorite themes are the ones played during the fight sequences, like Nightcore, that's played during the final fight scene between Uzi, N, V, J, and Sin. And of course, there's Eternal Dream. I can't even begin to list how many times I've listened to this song. It's such a nice, slow, and somewhat somber piece. It really highlights how dire the situation for our main cast is at this point. There's definitely more I could talk about, but I think you get the idea. There is definitely a lot going for this series that honestly makes it enjoyable. From the characters, to the writing, to the little details in the animation, it all comes together to make an enjoyable viewing experience. Now, as much praise as I've given this series, there are some issues I take with it. First, there's Thad. In the first episode, they set him up as one of Uzi's closest friends, and he does join both her and N when they initially investigate the solver. And they seem to imply that Uzi may or may not have a thing for him. But then after episode 4, he basically ceases to exist until episode 7, rendering him somewhat pointless. You could ultimately remove him from the show altogether, and it wouldn't be all that different. Honestly, what I think they should have done was have him more involved in the main plot. Like, have him comfort Uzi, who's still recovering after what happened at the end of episode 2. I don't know how exactly you would write this, but maybe you could have them have a conversation where he does comfort Uzi, and at the end, he ultimately encourages her to go see N. Or, at the very least, hint that she should go and see him. Or, maybe you could have it where, after Uzi breaks out of Doll's bathroom, she runs into Thad, explains what she saw, and Thad suggests that she should go and see N for help. Uzi initially hesitates, but ultimately goes off and finds N. Cut to episode 4, where you could have him join N when investigating the cabin. Like, maybe you could have them talk about Uzi, and it's here when N realizes that he might have feelings for Uzi, and maybe have Thad say something or hint in the dialogue that he only sees Uzi as a friend, better setting up N and Uzi's relationship. What we got in the final show was fine, but just like other aspects of the show, I feel like their relationship was a bit rushed. But anyway, cut to episode 6 and have him stay in the bunker while Uzi and the others head off, so you can have him see what else he can find out about the solver, giving a much better setup for both him, Con, and Lizzie's involvement in episodes 7 and 8. Speaking of Lizzie, she's depicted as the popular school bully, but she's also randomly friends with V? Like, what? When did that happen? I really do think that most of this show's flaws could have been alleviated if there had been a few more episodes to work with. Like, maybe what they could have done was show how, thanks to Uzi, the worker drones are slowly opening up to the disassembly drones. Or, at the very least, are becoming more comfortable with the idea of leaving the base whenever they want to. And maybe on top of that, have 1 or 2 episodes showcasing their dynamic, giving more weight to Lizzie going to the Spire in episode 7, as it's later revealed that she was in contact with V during the events of episode 6. And as for Con, what I think they should have done was subtly show him changing his mind regarding the idea of cowering in the bunker, due to Uzi now investigating the solver and subsequently Nori, and maybe slowly show him becoming more involved in her investigation as well. I mean, I guess they kind of did at the beginning of episodes 4 and 5, but that's really it. I don't know, just something to explain why he's even going to the Spire in the first place, and what made him realize what Nori was talking about in her crazed ramblings prior to her disappearance. Like, maybe have a scene where he's in that closet with Nori's stuff, and he's going over all the stuff she wrote and drew, and he starts reflecting on what has happened to both him and the others up until this point, and he has an epiphany. Just something to better explain why he's randomly out of the bunker with Uzi's gun, and seemingly now understanding what Nori was talking about all those years ago. My next biggest criticism is the show's pacing and the show's overall length. Now, as much as I've praised the show for how quick and fast paced it is, it's also one of the things that's admittedly working against it. As on one hand, the series' full attention is on the overarching story from start to finish. But on the other hand, that leaves very little time for character moments and world building. Like, there is very little time for the show to fully stop and allow the audience to properly digest what's happening on screen. Which leads me to another criticism of the series, and that it's really confusing. Not to the point where you have no idea what's happening, as stated previous, but because of the quick pacing, again, there is very little time for the audience to fully digest what's happening. A good example of how the quick pacing kind of hurts the show is episodes like Cabin Fever and Home. They just drop you right in the middle of the action. Now, I have no problem when movies or shows do this. My issue stems from the lack of exposition. Most of it is done through dialogue that you have to pay very close attention to. I mean, yeah, Cabin Fever did have a flashback sequence, but even then, it still leaves more questions than answers. For example, what led to Uzi to ask Khan about the camp at the start of the flashback? Or in Home, where Uzi says that the solver is trying to access N and V's memories to delete them. I guess it's because the solver wants the two of them to be fully subservient to it again? But I'm sorry, when and how did that happen? I feel like we're missing a lot of context. Like, maybe what they should have done is have subtle hints that the solver still had a hold on N and V, and then have it where their memories are what's stopping the solver from resetting them, putting them back under its control. Then have the episode either open up with a brief flashback sequence of N and V glitching out and fully reverting back to their disassembly drone look with the big X on their visors. Uzi and Thad manage to stop them and temporarily put them to sleep somehow, and then have Uzi hack into their systems to understand what's happening. I get that the episode is supposed to serve as the backstory for Sin, V, J, and N, but I just feel like there could have been more to help eliminate the confusion. Another issue I have is Uzi and the solver. Like, the main conflict in the show is Uzi slowly losing control over herself to the absolute solver, leading to what we see in episode 7's mass destruction. But then, after Nori slaps her, she seems to regain full control over herself and the solver within her. Like, what? I feel like we're missing something here. Like, maybe they could have done something where Uzi, over the course of the show, is slowly learning how to control the solver, which would explain how she's able to control her new powers with little to no trouble in episodes like Cabin Fever. And in turn, she's slowly gaining more strength to fight off the solver. Then, when Nori slaps her, it's the final hit that is needed to help her fully regain control. I mean, I guess that's what they were going for in the original episode, but I feel like they could have made it a bit more clear. So overall, most of the issues I have stem from the pacing, which is due to the fact that the series only consists of 8 episodes total. What we got was fine, but had there been more episodes or a second season, I think most of my problems with the show would probably be non-existent. So, what are my overall thoughts on Murder Drones? While not perfect, it's definitely a decent watch. I mean, I literally purchased 2 of the figurines they produce as merchandise for the show. And while I wish we could have gotten more episodes and seasons, I'm still overall pleased with the final product. I highly recommend you check out the series if you haven't already. I mean, it's free to watch here on YouTube, on Glitch Productions' YouTube channel. Give this series and their other shows a watch, like The Amazing Digital Circus, Meta Runner, and their two newest shows, which are still in development as of the making of this video, those being The Gaslight District and The Knights of Guinevere, which is their first 2D animated show. One of the creators is also Data Terrace. And given how the Owl House turned out, yeah, I highly recommend giving the pilot a watch when it drops. And if you're pleased with the content and have a couple of extra bucks to spare, then check out their merch store, as all proceeds go back into funding their shows and future endeavors. I'd also like to give a shout out to a user named Cartoon Universe and his video, The Complete Story of Murder Drones, Explained, as it was very helpful in deciphering most of the little details in the show when making this review. Because again, this series can be a bit confusing at times. Link in the description. Now with all that being said, I give Murder Drones Season 1 and subsequently the show as a whole a 6 out of 10. This has been Sodor Pro, and until the next video, thanks for watching.